"Sir, I'm sorry, but you cannot board the aircraft dressed like that." The words hit Zephyr Caldwell like a physical blow as he stood at the gate of Terminal C at Kansas City International Airport. The security agent, a stern-faced man in his 50s, gestured dismissively at Zephyr's worn clothing, a threadbare jacket that had seen too many nights in homeless shelters, pants with carefully mended holes, and shoes that were more duct tape than leather. Around him, passengers stopped their conversations and turned to stare. Some pulled out their phone, already recording what they assumed would be another viral airport drama. Zephyr felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in his chest, the same feeling that had haunted him for the past 3 years since he had arrived in America, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a head full of nightmares from a war-torn country he could never return. "Please," Zephyr whispered, his accent making the words sound even more desperate. "My family. They are waiting for me in Seattle. This ticket, it took me months to save for it." The boarding agent looked at the crumpled ticket in Zephyr's trembling hands with obvious skepticism. "Sir, this is a first-class ticket. Are you sure this belongs to you?" "Yes, it is mine. I saved every dollar from my work at the restaurant. I need to see my cousin. He said he could help me find a real job, a place to live." The crowd around them was growing larger, and Zephyr could hear the whispered comments and judgments. He had experienced this kind of scrutiny before, the way people looked at him like he was something dirty, something that didn't belong in their clean, ordered world. "I'm going to need to see some identification," the agent said, clearly hoping to find a reason to deny Zephyr boarding. Zephyr fumbled in his jacket pocket for his refugee documentation, the papers that marked him as a legal resident but somehow never seemed to make him feel like he truly belonged anywhere. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the papers and they scattered across the polished airport floor. As he knelt to gather them up, the humiliation became too much. 3 years of sleeping in shelter, of working kitchen jobs for below minimum wage, of being treated like he was invisible, or worse, unwanted, crashed down on him all at once. He began to break down right there in the middle of the boarding area, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Hey, what's the problem here?" The voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. Zephyr looked up from where he was kneeling on the floor to see a tall man in a Kansas City Chiefs hoodie and jeans approaching the scene. The man moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge, and there was something in his voice that made everyone around them stop and pay attention. Travis Kelce had been heading to his gate for a flight to Seattle, where he was scheduled for a charity event the next day, when he noticed the commotion. He had seen enough situations like this in his travels to recognize the signs of someone being discriminated against, and something about the man's obvious distress struck a chord deep in his chest. "There's no problem, sir," the boarding agent said, clearly recognizing Travis despite his casual attire. "We're just conducting a routine verification." Routine verification? Travis looked around at the crowd of people recording with their phone, at the papers scattered on the floor, at Zephyr still kneeling and trying to collect his documentation with shaking hand. "This doesn't look routine to me." Travis knelt down beside Zephyr and began helping him gather the paper. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Zephyr," came the whispered response. "Zephyr Caldwell." "Well, Zephyr, I'm Travis, and it looks like we're both heading to Seattle today." Travis stood up and handed the papers to the boarding agent. "Everything appears to be in order here. He's traveling with me." "Sir, I don't think you understand," the agent began, but Travis held up a hand to stop him. "No, I think you don't understand. This man has a valid ticket and proper documentation. He's boarding this plane, and he's sitting in first class with me." The crowd around them had gone completely silent, phones still recording, but their operators struck speechless by what they were witnessing. Travis Kelce, one of the most recognizable athletes in America, was defending a homeless-looking refugee against airline discrimination, and he was doing it with the kind of quiet authority that left no room for argument. "But, sir," the agent protested weakly, "the other first-class passengers might complain about what? About sharing a cabin with another human being who has every right to be there?" Travis's voice had taken on an edge that suggested this conversation was over. "If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." Travis helped Zephyr to his feet and guided him toward the boarding tunnel. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you home." As they walked down the jet bridge, Zephyr struggled to process what had just happened. For 3 years, He had felt invisible, unwanted, like a burden that society grudgingly tolerated. And now, out of nowhere, one of the most famous people in America had not only noticed him, but had stood up for him in front of dozens of strangers. "Why?" Zephyr asked as they approached the airplane door. "Why are you helping me?" Travis paused and looked at him thoughtfully. "Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. And because I have a feeling there's more to your story than what meets the eye." The flight attendant at the door, a kind-faced woman named Marlo Henderson, greeted them with a professional smile that became genuine when she saw the obvious emotion on both men's faces. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly. "First class is right this way." Bariti. As they settled into their seats, Zephyr felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, his luck was finally starting to change. But what he didn't know was that the real test was just beginning, and the reaction of his fellow first-class passengers would either validate Travis's faith in human decency or prove that some prejudices run too deep to overcome. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Zephyr gripped the armrests of his leather seat, trying to make himself as small and unnoticed as possible. He had learned that the best way to avoid trouble was to remain invisible, but in first class, surrounded by well-dressed business travelers and wealthy tourists, invisibility was not an option. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 757 was a world away from anything Zephyr had ever experienced. The seats were wide and covered in supple leather, each equipped with its own entertainment system and enough legroom for someone twice his size. He sat rigidly upright, afraid to touch anything, afraid to draw attention to himself, afraid that at any moment someone would realize there had been a mistake and escort him back to the terminal. Marlo Henderson approached with a tray of pre-flight beverages, her smile genuine, free of the judgment Zephyr had grown accustomed to seeing in people's eyes. "Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff?" she asked. "We have orange juice, coffee, champagne." "Orange juice, please," Zephyr said quietly, still hardly believing that someone was offering him a choice of beverages served in actual glassware rather than plastic cups. "Of course." Marlo poured the juice and handed it to him with a small napkin. "Is this your first time in first class?" Zephyr nodded, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "My first time on any airplane, actually." "Well, then this is extra special. If you need anything at all during the flight, just press this button here, okay?" For the first time in months, Zephyr felt a glimmer of what he remembered dignity feeling like. He was being treated like a human being, like someone whose comfort and well-being mattered. It was such a simple thing, but after years of being invisible or unwanted, it felt revolutionary. Travis, who was sitting across the aisle, caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. "First time flying, huh? It's pretty amazing once you get used to it." "Thank you," Zephyr said, his voice thick with emotion, "for what you did back then. I don't know how to—" "Don't worry about it," Travis said easily. "We've all been in situations where we needed someone to stand up for us, but their moment of peace was short-lived." From the seat behind Zephyr came the voice of Quinlan Rutherford, a well-dressed businessman in his 60s who had been watching the entire interaction with growing disapproval. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Quinlan announced loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "I pay thousands of dollars for these seats, and I have to share the space with this?" The word "this" hit Zephyr like a slap. He had heard variations of it before, when people talked about refugees, homeless people, anyone they considered beneath their notice. But hearing it spoken so brazenly, so casually cruel, in this confined space where he couldn't escape, made his stomach turn. "Excuse me?" Travis turned in his seat to face Quinlan, his voice carrying a warning that the businessman either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "Oh, come on," Quinlan continued, emboldened by what he perceived as support from other passengers who had begun to murmur among themselves. "Look at him. He obviously doesn't belong here. This is supposed to be first class, not a homeless shelter." Zephyr felt his face burning with shame. He wanted to disappear, to somehow melt into the expensive leather seat and cease to exist. This was exactly what he had feared would happen. exactly why he usually tried to remain invisible. No good deed, no matter how kindly intended, could overcome the fundamental truth that people like Quinlan saw him as less than human. "I think you need to mind your own business," Travis, his voice low and dangerous. "My business? My business is flying in comfort without having to worry about whether my luggage is going to get stolen or whether I'm going to catch something from sitting next to someone who clearly hasn't seen the inside of a shower in weeks." The accusations hung in the air like poison. Zephyr knew they weren't true. He made sure to wash at the community center every day, kept his clothes as clean as possible given his circumstances, but the words still cut deep because they reflected what he knew people thought when they looked at him. Seraphina Blackwood, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, sitting with her 8-year-old son, Caspian, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been watching the interaction with growing unease, torn between her natural sympathy for someone obviously struggling and her protective instincts regarding her child. "Maybe we should all just try to enjoy the flight," Marlowe interjected diplomatically, clearly hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "Enjoy the flight?" Quinlan's voice rose. "How am I supposed to enjoy anything when I'm worried about my safety and the safety of other passengers?" "Your safety?" Travis stood up, his 6'5" frame suddenly making the first-class cabin feel very small. "What exactly do you think this man is going to do to you?" Zephyr wanted to speak up, to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't a threat to anyone. But the words stuck in his throat, just as they always did when confronted with this kind of hostility. 3 years of being treated like an unwanted burden had taught him that speaking up often only made things worse. "I think we all know what these people are capable of," Quinlan said, his meaning clear, even though he didn't say it explicitly. The silence that followed was deafening. Zephyr felt the weight of every eye in the cabin on him, felt the familiar crushing sensation of being judged and found wanting before anyone even knew his story. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine himself somewhere else, anywhere else, but trapped in this metal tube with people who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be solved or a threat to be contained. But then, something unexpected happened. From the seat beside Seraphina came a small, pained whimper. Caspian, who had been quietly playing a game on his tablet, suddenly doubled over in his seat, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Caspian!" Seraphina's voice immediately shifted from uncomfortable to panic. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" The 8-year-old couldn't answer. He was clutching his stomach and breathing in short, rapid gasps that suggested he was in serious distress. His forehead was covered with sweat, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look much younger and more vulnerable than his years. "Oh, God," Seraphina said, her voice breaking. "Marlowe, I need help. Something's wrong with my son." The medical emergency shifted the atmosphere in the cabin instantly. Quinlan's complaints about Zephyr suddenly seemed petty and irrelevant in the face of a child's obvious suffering. Marlowe rushed over with a medical kit, while other passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. And Zephyr, despite everything that had just been said about him, felt his instincts take over. He had experience with sick children, painful experience that he tried not to think about too often. Without thinking about the consequences or the potential for further rejection, he started to rise from his seat. Zephyr's movement was instinctive, born from memories that lived deep in his bone. He had seen that particular shade of gray-pale skin before, had witnessed the same shallow breathing and pain-induced confusion. His body moved before his mind could stop it, years of experience overriding the fear of further humiliation. "Wait," he said quietly, standing up despite the hostile atmosphere that still lingered in the cabin. "I think I might be able to help." Seraphina's reaction was immediate and defensive. "Don't touch him," she snapped, positioning herself between Zephyr and her suffering son. "Stay away from my child!" The rejection hit Zephyr like a physical blow, but he could see that Caspian's condition was worsening. The boy's breathing was becoming more labored, and his small hands were clutching his stomach with increasing desperation. "I understand your concern," Zephyr said gently, his accent thickening with emotion. "But I have experience with children who are sick. I used to work in a medical clinic before." "Before what?" Quinlan interjected harshly. Before you became homeless? Before you started living in the streets? You think we're going to trust a vagrant with a sick child? Zephyr felt his resolve crumbling under the weight of their suspicion and fear. He sank back into his seat, watching helplessly as Caspian continued to suffer. This was exactly why he had learned to remain invisible, why he had stopped trying to help even when he saw people in need. Every attempt to reach out, to offer the skills and knowledge he possessed, ended in rejection and humiliation. Marlowe was doing her best with the airline's limited medical supplies, but it was clear she was out of her depth. "Does anyone on this flight have medical training?" she called out to the cabin, silent. Zephyr knew he should speak up again, should push past the fear and rejection to offer what help he could, but the words wouldn't come. He had been pushed back into his shell, wounded by the assumption that his circumstances made him untrustworthy and dangerous. Travis had been watching the entire exchange with growing understanding. He could see the conflict in Zephyr's eyes, the way he was simultaneously desperate to help and terrified of further rejection. There was something in the man's bearing, in the way he had moved toward the sick child, that spoke of real knowledge and experience. "Zephyr," Travis said quietly, moving to crouch beside his seat. "Do you know what's wrong with the boy?" Zephyr nodded reluctantly. I think it might be appendicitis. The way he is holding his stomach, the color of his skin, the sweating. I have seen it before." "Where did you see it before?" I was a medical student in my country, before the war, and after I came here, I worked in a free clinic for refugee children. I have seen this many times." Travis felt something click into place. This wasn't just a homeless man who had managed to scrape together enough money for a plane ticket. This was someone with real medical knowledge, someone who could potentially help a suffering child, if only the people around him could get past their prejudice long enough to let him try. "What would you do if that was your patient?" Travis asked. "I would check for rebound tenderness in the lower right abdomen, take his temperature, and if my suspicions were confirmed, I would recommend immediate surgery when we land. But first, I would try to make him comfortable and slow the progression of inflammation." Travis stood up and walked over to where Serafina was hovering anxiously over her son. "Serafina, right? I need you to listen to me. Is there a doctor on board?" she asked desperately. "Someone needs to help him." "There is someone who can help," Travis said carefully. "Zephyr was a medical student before he came to America. He's worked with sick children in refugee clinic. He thinks he knows what's wrong with Caspian." "Him?" Serafina's voice was sharp with disbelief. "He's homeless. He's probably on drugs, mentally ill, or he's a refugee who lost everything in a war and has been trying to rebuild his life ever since." Travis interrupted firmly. "And right now, he might be your son's best hope." Caspian whimpered again, a sound that tore at every parent's heart within hearing distance. His condition was clearly deteriorating, and the limited medical supplies on the airplane were proving inadequate for whatever was wrong with him. Travis turned back to Zephyr, who was watching the scene with obvious pain. "I need you to trust," Travis said, "and I need these people to trust. Can you handle that?" Zephyr looked at the sick child, then at the mother's frightened face, then at Quinlan's continued disapproval. Every instinct told him to stay in his seat, to avoid further humiliation and rejection. But there was a child suffering, and he had knowledge that might help. "I will try," he said quietly, standing up again. Travis nodded and addressed the cabin with the kind of natural authority that made people listen. Sometimes the most skilled hands are the ones that have seen the most suffering. "Zephyr, show us what you can do." With trembling hands, Zephyr approached Caspian's seat. The boy's eyes were glazed with pain and fever, and he was making small, distressed sounds that reminded Zephyr achingly of his younger brother, lost years ago in the chaos of war. "Hello, little one," Zephyr said softly, his voice taking on the gentle tone he had once used in the pediatric ward of a hospital that no longer existed. "My name is Zephyr. Can you tell me where it hurts?" Caspian pointed weakly to his lower right side. Zephyr nodded and looked at Serafina, who was watching his every movement with the intensity of a mother protecting her young. "I need to touch his abdomen very gently to check for inflammation," Zephyr explained. "It will not hurt him more, I promise, but I need to confirm what I suspect." Serafina hesitated for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but if you hurt him, I understand," Zephyr said simply. He knelt beside Caspian's seat, and gently placed his hands on the boy's stomach. His touch was professional and sure, the movements of someone who had done this examination hundreds of times before. He pressed lightly in several different areas, watching Caspian's reactions carefully. Definite rebound tenderness in McBurney's point, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Then, louder, "Do we have a thermometer? And some ice?" Marlowe hurried to get both items. When she returned, Zephyr took Caspian's temperature and nodded grimly at the reading. "It is appendicitis," he announced to the cabin. "Early stage, but it will get worse quickly if we do not take action." "What kind of action?" Serafina asked, her voice tight with fear. "Ice to help with inflammation and pain, and we need to contact the ground immediately to have a surgical team ready when we land. This child will need his appendix removed within hours." As Marlowe hurried to contact the cockpit about the medical emergency, Zephyr found himself settling into a role he hadn't occupied in years. The familiar rhythm of patient care began to override his anxiety about the hostile reception he had received from the other passengers. Here was something he understood, something he was genuinely good at, despite what his current circumstances might suggest to others. "Caspian," he said gently, placing a cool cloth on the boy's forehead. "I know you are in pain, but I need you to be very brave for me, okay? I am going to help you feel better." The 8-year-old looked up at him with eyes that were bright with fever, still alert. "Are you a real doctor?" he asked in a small voice. Zephyr felt the familiar ache of lost dream, of a life interrupted by circumstances beyond his control. "I was training to be one," he said honestly, "and I have helped many children who felt just like you do right now." "In the hospital?" "In a clinic, yes. In my country, and also here in America. I worked with children who had come from far away and were scared and hurt." Serafina watched this interaction with growing amazement. The man she had initially feared and rejected was speaking to her son with a gentleness and competence that was undeniably authentic. There was something in his manner, in the way he moved his hands and spoke in soothing tones, that spoke of real medical training experience. "What country are you from?" Caspian asked, momentarily distracted from his pain by curiosity. "Syria," Zephyr replied, continuing to monitor the boy's pulse while they talked. "It is very far from here, but it used to be very beautiful." "Why did you leave?" The question hung in the air, loaded with all the complexity of war and loss and survival that most Americans could barely comprehend. Zephyr was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, when there is fighting in a place, families have to leave to stay safe. I came here to find a new home." Travis, who had been listening to this conversation while coordinating with Marlowe about the ground preparations, felt his heart clench. He was beginning to understand the depth of loss this man had experienced. The journey from medical student to refugee to homeless person struggling to survive in a foreign country. "Caspian, I need you to lie very still for me," Zephyr continued, his voice taking on the professional tone of someone giving medical instruction. "The ice is going to help with the swelling in your tummy, but you cannot move around too much, okay?" "Okay," Caspian whispered, clearly trusting this gentle stranger despite his mother's initial reservation. Zephyr began to sing softly in Arabic, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him when he was sick as a child. The melody was haunting and beautiful, filled with all the longing and love of a culture and family that existed now only in memory. The effect on Caspian was immediate. His breathing began to slow and deepen, and some of the tension left his small body. The pain was still there, but the music seemed to provide a kind of comfort that went beyond mere distraction. Serafina felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her son respond to this man's care. "What is that song?" she asked quietly. "A lullaby my mother sang to me," Zephyr replied, without stopping his gentle ministrations. "It is about birds flying over mountains to find their family. She used to tell me that no matter how far we traveled, love would always guide us home." "It's beautiful," Serafina said, and for the first time since meeting Zephyr, her voice carried no trace of suspicion or fear. Quinlan Rutherford, who had been conspicuously silent since Caspian's medical crisis began, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was witnessing something that challenged every assumption he had made about the man he had so readily dismissed as dangerous and unworthy. The gentle competence with which Zephyr was caring for the sick child was undeniable, and it was making Quinlan deeply uncomfortable about his earlier behavior. "How did you learn to do this?" Travis asked, genuinely curious about Zephyr's background. My father was a doctor, Zephyr replied, continuing to monitor Caspian's vital signs while he spoke. I was in my 3rd year of medical school when the war started. After that, he shrugged, a gesture that contained worlds of lost possibility. And when you came to America? I tried to continue my studies, but my credentials were not recognized here. I would need to start over completely, take all the exams again, do residency. It cost so much money, and I had nothing. So you worked in a clinic instead? Zephyr nodded. For refugee children, many of them came here with trauma, with illnesses, with no one to trust. I could speak their languages, understand their fears. It was not the same as being a doctor, but it was still helping. What happened to that job? Serafina asked gently. Zephyr's face clouded over. The funding was cut. The clinic closed 6 months ago. After that, I could not find other work. Without an address, without references that employers would accept, it became very difficult. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Here was a man who had lost his country, his family, his profession, and finally even his home, but who still possessed the skills and compassion to help a suffering child when the need arose. Cordelia Ashwood, an elderly woman in her 70s who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up for the first time. My grandson is about Caspian's age, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. If he were sick like this, I would want someone exactly like you taking care of him. The validation meant more to Zephyr than he could express. For months, he had felt like he was disappearing, becoming less and less visible to the world around him. But here, in this airplane cabin, people were finally seeing him as he truly was. Not a burden or a threat, but a human being with value and dignity and something meaningful to contribute. The ice is helping, Zephyr announced, checking Caspian's abdomen again. The inflammation is not getting worse, and his fever is stable. But he will definitely need surgery when we land. How long until we reach Seattle? Serafina asked anxiously. Marlowe, who had been in constant communication with the cockpit, returned with an update. 45 minutes, she announced, and there will be a full medical team waiting at the gate, including a pediatric surgeon who specializes in emergency appendectomy. Thank God, Serafina breathed. She looked at Zephyr with tears in her eyes. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have been fine, Zephyr said modestly, but I am glad I could help. Caspian had drifted into a more comfortable sleep, still holding on to the cloth doll that Zephyr had given him to comfort himself during the worst of the pain. The crisis was far from over, but the immediate danger had been managed, and the boy was stable enough to make it to the hospital. And for the first time in months, Zephyr felt like himself again. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had undergone a complete transformation. The hostility and suspicion that had greeted Zephyr at the beginning of the flight had been replaced by something approaching reverence. Passengers who had initially viewed him as an unwelcome intruder were now watching him with respect and admiration as he continued to monitor Caspian's condition with professional competence. Travis settled into the seat beside Zephyr, speaking quietly so as not to disturb the sleeping child. You have a gift, he said simply. I hope you know that. Zephyr looked at him with surprise. I am just doing what anyone with medical training would do. No, Travis said firmly. What you're doing goes beyond medical training. The way you connected with Caspian, the way you made him feel safe and comforted, that's not something you can learn in a textbook. That comes from the heart. In my country, we have a saying, Zephyr replied thoughtfully. The hands that have known the most pain are often the gentlest when they touch others. Is that why you're so good with children? Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. I had a younger brother, he said finally, Malik. He was only 6 when the bombing started. I took care of him when he was sick, when he was scared, when he had nightmares about the sounds of war. Oh, what happened to him? Travis asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We were separated during the evacuation. I have been looking for him for 3 years, but Zephyr's voice trailed off, and he shrugged in that way that suggested he had learned to accept unbearable loss. Travis felt a crushing weight in his chest as he began to understand the full scope of what this man had endured. Not only had he lost his country, his career, and his home, but he had lost his family as well, including a little brother he had clearly loved deeply. Every time I see a child who is suffering, Zephyr continued, I see Malik. I think about how scared he must have been, how much he needed someone to take care of him. If I can help one child feel safe, feel comforted, then maybe somehow I am still taking care of him too. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and Marlowe immediately moved into action. Coordinating with the ground crew for Caspian's medical transfer, Zephyr carefully lifted the sleeping boy in his arms, cradling him with the practiced ease of someone who had carried many sick children. "I will carry him to the medical team," he told Serafina. "It is better if he does not wake up until we reach the hospital." As they disembarked, a full medical team was waiting at the gate with a gurney and emergency equipment. Zephyr gently transferred Caspian to the paramedic, giving them a detailed report of the boy's condition and the treatment he had provided during the flight. "You did excellent work," the lead paramedic told him. "Your assessment was spot on, and the care you provided probably prevented the appendix from rupturing. This kid is lucky you were on that plane." Serafina approached Zephyr with tears streaming down her face. "I owe you an apology," she said. "And more than that, I owe you my son's life." "You owe me nothing," Zephyr replied. "I am just grateful I could help. But I do owe you something," Serafina insisted. She pulled out her phone and quickly wrote down her contact information. "I work for the Seattle Public School District. We're always looking for people with your skills and background to work with refugee children, to help them adjust to life here." She pressed the paper into his hands. "It's not a medical position, but it's working with children who need someone who understands what they've been through, someone who can speak their languages and help them feel less alone." Zephyr stared at the paper in disbelief. You would trust me to work with children? After how you reacted when we first met? After what I saw on that plane? After watching you care for my son with such skill and passion? I would trust you with any child in the world." Cordelia Ash, the elderly woman who'd spoken up during the flight, approached with her own business card. "I run a nonprofit that helps refugees transition to life in America," she said. "We provide temporary housing, job placement assistance, help with immigration paperwork. If you're serious about starting over in Seattle, we can help." One by one, the other passengers who had witnessed Zephyr's transformation from suspected threat to life-saving healer began to approach him with offers of assistance. Business cards, phone numbers, promises of help with housing and employment opportunities. The very people who had initially rejected him were now eager to welcome him into their community. Even Quinlan Rutherford, who had been the most vocal in his opposition to Zephyr's presence, approached hesitantly with shame written clearly across his face. "I owe you an apology," Quinlan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I said earlier, the way I treated you, it was inexcusable. You're a better man than I am, and that child is alive because of your skill and compassion." Zephyr looked at him with the same gentle expression he had shown throughout the flight. "We all make judgments based on fear," he said simply. "What matters is what we do when we learn we were wrong. Is there anything I can do? Any way I can help make up for, help other people like me?" Zephyr said. "When you see someone who looks lost or afraid or different, remember this moment. Remember that everyone has a story and everyone deserves a chance." Quinlan nodded, tears in his eyes, and walked away, a changed man. As the crowd began to disperse, and Caspian was taken away in the ambulance with his mother by his side, Travis and Zephyr found themselves alone in the gate area. "So what happens now?" Travis asked. "Are you really going to stay in Seattle?" Zephyr looked at the handful of business cards and phone numbers he had collected, still hardly believing that his life could change so dramatically in the course of a single flight. "I think so," he said slowly. "For the first time in 3 years, I have hope that things might get better." "They will get better," Travis said with conviction. "You've got skills, you've got heart, and now you've got people who believe in you. That's all anyone needs to build a new life." "Travis," Zephyr said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you did for me today, standing up for me at the gate, giving me a chance to show who I really am, you saved my life just as much as I helped that little boy." "You saved yourself," Travis replied. "I just made sure people were paying attention when you did it." They walked through the airport together, two men from completely different worlds who had found common ground in their shared humanity. "Can I ask you something?" Zephyr said as they approached the baggage claim area. "Anything. Why did you help me? You don't know me. You had no reason to believe I was anything more than what I appeared to be." Travis was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My grandfather was an immigrant," he said finally. "He came here from Ireland with nothing but the clothes on his back and a willingness to work hard. He faced discrimination, people who thought he didn't belong, people who judged him based on his accent and his circumstances. What happened to him? He became one of the most respected men in his community, built a successful business, raised a family, contributed more to his adopted country than most people who were born here. But he always remembered what it felt like to be an outsider, to be judged unfairly. And he taught you to look beyond appearances? He taught me that America is supposed to be the place where anyone can reinvent themselves, where your past doesn't determine your future. But that only works if we give people a chance to show us who they really are." Zephyr felt tears welling up in his eyes. "In my country, we have another saying. The stranger you help today may be the angel you need tomorrow." "I think you might have that backwards," Travis said with a smile. "I'm pretty sure you were the angel today." As they reached the exit, Serafina came running back from the ambulance, breathless and emotional. "Zephyr," she called out, "the surgeon says Caspian is going to be fine. They're taking him into surgery now, but she says your diagnosis was perfect and your care probably saved his life." "I am so glad," Zephyr said, relief flooding his voice. "And I wanted to give you this," Serafina continued, pressing a folded piece of paper into his hands. "It's a letter of recommendation. I know you don't have current references, but after what I saw today, I'll vouch for your character and your skills to anyone who will listen." Zephyr unfolded the paper and read the handwritten note that described him as a man of exceptional skill, compassion, and integrity, who saved my son's life and restored my faith in human kindness. "Thank you," he whispered, overwhelmed by the generosity of this woman who had initially feared and rejected him. "Thank you," she replied, "for giving my son back to me." Keith, as the automatic doors of the airport slid open and they stepped out into the cool Seattle evening, Zephyr took a deep breath of the Pacific Northwest air. It smelled different from Kansas City, fresher and full of possibility. "You know," Travis said as they waited for their respective rides, "I have a feeling this is the beginning of something incredible for you." "Maybe," Zephyr said, looking at the collection of business cards and phone numbers he held in his hands. "For the first time in years, I feel like I might have a future again." "You definitely have a future. And when you're ready, when you've gotten settled and started your new life, I'd love to hear from you. Maybe you can tell me about that clinic you're going to run someday." "Clinic? Come on," Travis grinned. "You think someone with your skills and heart is going to settle for anything less than changing the world? You're going to help so many people, Zephyr. Children who are scared and alone, families who need someone who understands what they're going through. You're going to be exactly the kind of doctor this country needs." Zephyr felt something shift inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in so long he had almost forgotten what it was like. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that might actually be worth living. "Maybe," he said, but this time he was smiling when he said it. Travis's ride arrived first, a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed celebrity transportation. But before he got in, he turned back to Zephyr one final time. "Remember," he said, "flying first class isn't about where you sit. It's about how you treat the people around you. And today, you showed everyone on that plane what first-class character really looks like." As Travis drove away, Zephyr stood alone outside the Seattle airport with a pocket full of opportunity and a heart full of hope. Tomorrow, he would start making phone calls, following up on job leads, looking for an apartment. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of rebuilding his life from the ground up. But tonight, the first time in 3 years, he felt like himself again. Not a refugee, not a homeless person, not a burden or a threat. Just Zephyr Caldwell, a man with skills and compassion and something valuable to offer the world. And somewhere in the city before him, a little boy named Caspian was recovering from surgery, alive and healthy, because a stranger had chosen compassion over fear, action over silence. It was, Zephyr thought as he waited for his own ride to arrive, a pretty good way to start a new life.